This is a portrait of Mary Moser, but who was she? Very few people today have heard of her yet. She was the youngest ever Royal Academician, and she was even proposed as a candidate for the President of the Royal Academy, which was the most prestigious appointment in art in the country. So I'll explain and also talk a bit about the difficulties faced by women artists. She was principally a flower painter, and I'll also explain why flower painting was important. And you might therefore be thinking that flower painting was a sort of respectable and unadventurous activity, but you'll see that later in my talk that her life was a lot more exciting than that. This is a portrait I've been showing you by George Romney, and it's the best known portrait we have of her. She was born in England, and together with Angelica Kaufman, they were the two founders of the Royal Academy who were women and were the most celebrated women artists of the 18th century in England. This portrait, she sat for it about 2 years after the Royal Academy was set up. She's painting, as you can see, a still life of fruit and foliage, and she's half turned to look at us. She's wearing not what she would normally be wearing. It's a sort of classicizing dress. It's a sort of classical tunic she's wearing. Her hair is arranged casually. She's got no jewelry and no cosmetics on, and she's at work. She's holding a paintbrush. I think of the smile she's got as an enigmatic sort of a Mona Lisa smile. It's not exact, it's not solemn, but it's not a full smile. One interpretation I quite like is that she's reluctantly agreed to be painted by the leading portrait painter of the day, George Romney, because it will help advertise the new academy. But actually she's been interrupted in her work and seems to be saying, well, I'll do this because it'll help the academy, but don't take too long. As I said, it was painted shortly after the Royal Academy was founded, and the principal founder of the Royal Academy was William Chambers. And so he had to work hard to gather together the best people to create the Royal Academy, the joint founders of the Royal Academy. And they were members of other societies, as we will hear. And so he was very active in pulling together the best. And the two women founders were very important additions because they were so well known at the time. They added to the prestige of the academy. However, once the Royal Academician committee, which was all male, once the committee sat and it was established, there were no more female members until Dame Laura Knight in 1936, which is 117 years later. Although, interestingly, George Romney, the artist who painted this, never joined the Royal Academy. He was enormously successful. He was even urged to join, but he maintained that a good artist should succeed without such cronyism, that he didn't need it, but it cost him valuable royal patronage. And towards the end of his life, he did sort of hint at that he did regret not joining the Royal Academy. It was very prestigious, the leading academy in the country. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to show you is this one. This is interesting. This is a self-portrait, and it was assumed for a long time that she copied the Romney portrait, but art historians aren't so sure now. They're researching it to try and establish which was painted first. And notice it's not an exact copy. The changes are interesting. She has, in the one on the left that she painted, she's pushed the fruit and the foliage into the background, which emphasizes her face more. So she's brought herself forward, and the face is less idealized, I think, and it does demonstrate that she was a competent portrait painter. Although my feeling, looking at the two, it's just my personal feeling, is that Romney has actually created a portrait that's a little bit, that sort of captured the living person more for me. These are her parents. She was the only daughter of George Michael Moser. Now, he was a leading artist and gold chaser, and he became the drawing master to the Prince of Wales, who was the sorry, I just got to stop, somebody's come on with a video on. I'll have to try and delete that later. He moved to England before she was born, and her artistic talents were clear very early on. When she was young, she won her first medal from the Society of Arts for a flower drawing that she did when she was 14. Now, as George Moser, was drawing master to the Prince, he knew all the celebrities of the day, and they came to his house. He knew Samuel Johnson, Oliver Goldsmith, all the leading artists, which meant that she grew up surrounded by the rich, the famous, and the intellectual elite of the day. And she was very hardworking, a dedicated professional, but surprisingly, she was very nearsighted. She had to sit with her nose an inch from the canvas. And someone pointed out at the time, it's astonishing with such an infirmity she could display such harmony. Here's an example. This is Flowers in a Basket. It's an early example of a painting. She painted it when she was 21. And this was the type of painting that led to her being recognized as someone that they wanted in the Royal Academy when it was founded. And she was, by then, when she was 21, one of the leading flower painters in the country. And flower painting was very popular, very important. Obviously, it was a nice thing to have on the wall as an alternative to a vase of flowers, but it's also much in demand for decorative designs, because people wanted to have flower designs on a lot of their vases and tableware and so on. It was a big market. And this was painted before the Royal Academy was founded, so it was paintings like this that established her reputation and led to her joining when she was just 24. So she is, in fact, the youngest Royal Academician ever, although normally you'll read that Turner is the youngest. They actually changed the rules, so he became an associate academician when he was 24, but a full academician when he was 26. The earliest you could be after they'd changed the rules. But as a founding member, she was actually a Royal Academician when she was 24. Let me step back and talk about the Royal Academy a bit. To put it in perspective, I'll talk about academies and schools, because they developed during the 18th century. This is Thomas Coram by William Hogarth. And just to put it in perspective, time scale wise, Hogarth died the year before the flower painting by Mary Moser that we've just seen. So he was the generation before. And he died before the Royal Academy was founded, a few years before. But he had his own school. Now, at the beginning of the 18th century, the fine art was only a province of the wealthy. There were no public galleries. There was no active discussion about art. Few knew about art. There were no books. And the people who saw it were the wealthy, the aristocrats, who went on the grand tour and saw art in Italy and bought art and brought it back to the country, but it was in their private houses. So it was only those that had access to the big aristocratic mansions in the country that saw any art. But by the end of the 18th century, there were public exhibitions, there was an active art market, there was a general discussion of art in the press, and Hogarth had an important role to play in this because his art appealed directly to the new middling sort. Now, Forum was the founder of the Foundling Hospital. Here's an early engraving of the hospital, or hospital, maybe not quite the right word, a care home for abandoned children. And it was visited by the rich and famous as, don't quite know how to describe it, a form of entertainment, in the same way that they would visit the prisons. They would visit the Foundling Hospital as a place for the rich and wealthy to meet. And so Hogarth and other artists displayed their work. And so, in a sense, the Foundling Hospital became the first public art gallery in England. At the same time, art societies and schools were being founded. Now, let me explain that. Before even the Foundling Hospital, this artist, Godfrey Kneller, founded the Kneller Academy, one of the earliest schools in the country. He was very well connected and very influential. He painted every monarch from Charles II to George I, and he was very influential on artists who said they owe their debt to him, such as William Hogarth, Alan Ramsay, Joshua Reynolds, Thomas Gainsborough, Joseph Wright of Derby. They all refer to the influence Godfrey Kneller had on them. Now, coming back to the Academy, the Kneller Academy was taken over by James Thornhill, Sir James Thornhill, and Thornhill then set up his own school after Kneller died, and he was succeeded on his death by his son-in-law, William Hogarth. William Hogarth married the daughter of Sir James Thornhill, who was a rung above William Hogarth in the class structure in Britain at the time. Now, Hogarth set up what was perhaps the most famous teaching school before the Royal Academy, and that's the St. Martin's Lane Academy. This is Johann Zoffany's A Life Class at St. Martin's Lane Academy. It shows a life drawing class, and the Academy had about 80 artists who were registered, and we can see from the rolls that about 30 to 40 artists came along each season, and the Academy offered life drawing classes every evening from October to March for 2 guineas. Life drawing was mostly from the male model, as we see here, but the St. Martin's School was the only drawing school in London that offered a female model twice weekly. And the people who attended Hogarth's Academy were some of the best known are Thomas Gainsborough, Alan Ramsay, Richard Wilson, Johann Zoffany, Richard Cosway, who we'll see later, and was intimately associated with Mary Moser. So it was the centre of artistic training in London, and later it sort of became subsumed into the Royal Academy. And worth pointing out, this person here is George Michael Moser, who became a director of the St. Martin's Academy, and he organised the life classes which I guess is why he's sitting there looking out at us. And he went on to become the first keeper, an important position, of the Royal Academy schools. There were other schools. I'm not giving a comprehensive history of the schools and academies in Britain, but a quick overview. This society, the Society of Dilettanti, was a society of noblemen and scholars who sponsored and studied ancient Greek and Roman art. And in fact, it's still in existence. It still meets to discuss art. And Horace Walpole said that the nominal qualification was having been to Italy on the Grand Tour, but the real qualification was being drunk. The society was quite a wealthy society, and it sponsored students to travel to Rome and Greece, and it had about 60 members. And the other society that is still in existence is the Royal Society of Arts. Originally, it was called William Shipley's Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, which was usually abbreviated to the Society of Arts. And Shipley's Society of Arts actually was one of the first, I think the first, to encourage women to become members. This building, incidentally, is the built by the Adams brothers, and it's still there today. It received royal patronage later in 1908. And so today it's commonly called the Royal Society of Arts, or the RSA. This is Joshua Reynolds, a self-portrait. Now, Joshua Reynolds, with some other artists, broke away from Shipley's Society of Arts and formed the confusingly similar named Society of Artists of Great Britain, which a few years later had 211 members and obtained a royal charter. Meanwhile, so Reynolds broke away and formed another society, but Shipley's Society of Arts split into two because there was an argument between the two leading architects in the society, Sir William Chambers, who was the architect of Somerset House, and James Payn, who designed some 90 buildings and also bridges, Richmond Bridge, Chertsey Bridge, Kew Bridge, one of the second Walton Bridge. Now, James Payn continued to run Shipley's Society of Arts, and William Chambers was without a society and wanted to set up his own society. Now, he had very strong connections with George III, and he persuaded the king to endorse the formation of what was became known as the Royal Academy of Arts, the Royal Academy, in December 1768, the end of 1768. And he persuaded Joshua Reynolds and 34 other leading artists to join. He wanted to attract and managed to attract the leading artists of the day to add to the prestige of the society. And one of the first things they did is they voted Reynolds in as the first president. It taught art as well. It was a school as well as a society of artists. It held a summer exhibition, which was very successful right from the beginning. And it limited its membership to, in those days, 40 academicians. And as I said, George Moser became the keeper. This is quite a well-known painting, the portraits of the academicians of the Royal Academy by Johann Zoffany. And the first thing I point out is one of the reasons this picture is often shown is the first two female academicians, Angelica Kaufmann and Mary Moser, were never allowed into the life drawing class. Actually, I don't think there was a rule against it, but it would have been too embarrassing for all concerned. They are represented instead by portraits on the right-hand wall. Angelica Kauffman on the left in the rectangular canvas, which she typically used, and Mary Moser on the right in the oval, wearing a yellow flower. Oval canvases are often used for flower paintings. They weren't even allowed to attend dinners or committee meetings or vote, even though the original petition that Chambers put together included their signatures. But there's something really odd about this painting, that if you look at the academicians, remember this is a life drawing class, but there's only one academician has a drawing instrument, this one here, which is Johann Sophony. He's included himself, it's a self-portrait of him, and he's holding a palette as if he'd just finished this painting. Now, there's a good reason they don't have drawing instruments. It's because they didn't want themselves to be seen as craftsmen, as simply skilled in painting. They're making the point that what they're doing is they're sitting there having an intellectual dispute about the various classical poses the model could take on, representing the different well-known, the different famous classical sculptures that have come down to us. So this is a painting that supports the Renaissance view that painting isn't just a skill, but it's a humanist endeavor that requires inspiration and creativity and knowledge, particularly of the classics. And incidentally, that was another reason, because many women weren't trained in the classics, another reason why they thought that women weren't able to paint some of the types of painting, like history painting, which I'll describe later. Just to the left, incidentally, of the centre, these are the two key founders, William Chambers on the left, and it's Sir Joshua Reynolds on the right, the first president. He's the one with the ear trumpet. I think it was an illness when he was young. He had to use an ear trumpet all of his life. And interestingly, it's not, in fact, just the academicians. There is some guests as well, particularly this chap here, Tan Che Kwa, was a Chinese artist who was visiting London at the time. So they invited him along, and he's included in the portrait. George Moser, her father, the keeper, is setting up the model's pose. And notice there's a string coming from the ceiling. It's a sling to help support his hand in comfort, so that he can hold a pose with his hand raised for a long period of time. And the person I want you to remember from this picture is this one here, Richard Cosway, a flattering a portrait painter who flattered the sitters, and he was one of the leading portrait. In fact, he was more popular at the time than Thomas Gainsborough, and he was also a famous dandy, looking the part here. And if you notice where his cane is positioned, denigrating the antique female torso by poking it with his cane. And here reason I mention him is because of his connection with Mary Moser, that I'll come back to later. Another, I think the only other early painting of all the academicians, this is the Royal Academicians in General Assembly by Henry Singleton. Interestingly, Angelica Kauffman and Mary Moser are there present. They weren't actually allowed into the General Assembly, but they're shown here on the right hand of the president, the then president, after Joshua Reynolds had died, which was the American artist Benjamin West. He was an established artist in America, and he was sponsored to go on a grand tour of Europe. And on his way back to America, he stopped in London and never left. He spent the rest of his life in London and became president of the Royal Academy. So you'll notice Kaufman and Moser are sort of at the peak, at the apex of the picture. And as I said, the Benjamin West was the new president because Joshua Reynolds had died, but he's included in this picture up here. That's a self-portrait of Joshua Reynolds. And then finally, the only other person I'll point out is William Chambers again. He's seated centrally, and you'll notice the reason he's put in the center is because he was getting elderly by then, but he was the key founder, and in fact he died the year following this painting. I mentioned history painting in passing, but I wanted to talk about the hierarchy of genres, or the hierarchy of painting. Both terms are used. It was established originally in 16th century Italy, time of the Renaissance, but it was very much refined and standardized by the French Academy. And it held sway for some 300 years. I can't overemphasize the importance to artists, or the way that it was embedded in the very thinking of artists and connoisseurs and collectors. Now, let me go through the hierarchy. I've got this painting is actually by Benjamin West. It's Cleombrotus ordered into banishment by Leonidas II, king of Sparta. It's an incident where Cleombrotus was attempted to usurp the king, and when the king, who's here, returns, he sentences him to death. But the king's daughter here is married to Cleombrotus, and she pleads for her husband's life, and his daughter's tears move him to commuting the death sentence to just banishment. So like a lot of, the reason I'm telling the story is that it was very important that history paintings embodied something ennobling, and here it's mercy is what is being represented. And it's also referring to a lesser known story from Greek history. So that was the peak of what an artist could paint, history paintings. Next down the hierarchy was portrait painting. This was painted by Joshua Reynolds. And it's interesting that in this portrait of Lady Talbot, he's elevated it into a type of history painting by dressing her in these classicizing clothes and by these elements, or these classicizing elements in the picture. And so he's seeking to make this portrait almost a sort of semi-history painting. This would have been widely appreciated and recognized at the time. And then you'll see here, this is the third stage. The next level down is what are called genre paintings, confusingly, because this is the whole thing is the hierarchy of genres, but this is genres, or more clearly described, I think, as subject painting. And it contains one or more people, but it's not a portrait. The people, if there are people represented, they're not portraits of those people. And sometimes the subject is intended to be humorous, but not always, but it's hardly ever elevating or noble. That would make it a history painting. Unusually, this particular painting was painted by a nobleman, Nathaniel Bacon, and it was painted in 1620. And in fact, it's the earliest subject painting in the history of English art, and it's in the Tate, although unfortunately it's a painting I love and love to talk about, but it's not on display at the moment. Then there's 3 categories which were rarely painted during the Renaissance, so they're later additions, but they are included in the hierarchy as described by the French Academy. There was, first of all, landscape painting, which may include people, but they'd be very small, and they were called staffage, which means sort of human additions to add to the landscape, but not really as sort of a human presence, but in a small way. This is painting by Thomas Gainsborough, sunset, cart horses drinking at a stream. Then there was animal painting, no humans present, 5th down the hierarchy. And animals were admired for their beauty, but also they could represent human emotions. This you probably recognize is by George Stubbs, it's Whistle Jacket, and it was regarded as audacious at the time because of its plain background. It created quite a stir, and it challenged the hierarchy because because of its size and the plain background. It sort of elevates it, or attempts to elevate it from its lowly place as an animal painting. And then finally, still life, the type of painting Mary Moser specialized in. It could still be elevating because there was a type of still life called memento mori, which literally means remember you have to die. And such paintings often contain a skull, or perhaps just some wilting flowers. Now, all artists and connoisseurs, as I said, would recognize all these categories and would place each painting within this strict hierarchy. And the other way that they were separated out is that still life was regarded as, and I don't think this is entirely true, but it was regarded as mechanical copying of a particular appearance. So it had reduced art to a mere skill, if you like, whereas history painting at the other end wasn't to do with the skill of the painting, it was to do with the intellectual rigor that had been applied and making the eternal universal essence of things and their most noble and uplifting spirit apparent to the viewer. Now, I've been talking about Mary Moser as a flower painter, but this is a list. I won't go through them, but I just wanted to show that from records that were kept at the time, including catalogues and pictures displayed at the Royal Academy by Mary Moser, you can see that she wasn't just a flower painter. She painted figures, and even some of these are history paintings, but very few of these paintings survive. And only one of her sketches remains, this one. Now, that leads me on to a different area. In order to represent the human figure accurately, which of course was essential for history paintings and portrait paintings, and to some extent genre paintings, the art student had to learn anatomy. And one way to do this was to draw the naked figure, the nude, so that the clothed figure could be painted accurately. In other words, life drawing wasn't so much about learning how to paint the nude, it was learning how to paint, how to learn, I should say, anatomy, so that the musculature and the stance and the position of a clothed figure was done accurately. And artists could, or claim they could tell if someone wasn't properly trained in life drawing. So how did Mary Moser obtain this skill to paint the pictures listed on the left-hand side? Well, this is speculation, but her father was the keeper, and he was one of those that obtained models for the life class. So the speculation is that privately he arranged models for her and chaperoned her while she drew. Now, this one here is a woman, and that may have been easier to arrange, but she must have also sketched men, as Angelica Kaufman did. We have more sketches from Angelica Kaufman, and some of those are male nudes. And it's difficult to overemphasize the importance of life drawing. It's the center of artistic training. It revolved around life drawing. It was the peak of what you were taught. In fact, Diderot, in his encyclopedia, defined an academy as a public school where painters go to draw and paint, and sculptors to model after a nude man called the model. In other words, an academy, an art school, sole purpose was to go along to learn how to paint and draw a nude. Well, let me carry on. This is one of the few non-flower paintings by Mary Moser that survives, unfortunately. You may have one in your attic, so I suggest you go and have a look after the talk. Joseph Nollekens was considered to be the finest British sculptor of the late 18th century, and is shown here scrutinizing a modello that he's carving in clay. And Moser is showing her skill at representing the clothed male body, the interesting pose, and the nude modello. And in fact, there's an interesting angle to this in that there was a lot of discussion from the Renaissance period about whether painting or sculpture was the greater art. And Moser, I think, here is capturing both the sculptor and the sculpture, and is staking a claim, I think, for painting as the greater art, because it's encompassing the two aspects, the sculptor and the sculpture. Nollekens, by the way, was son of a Flemish painter and studied in London, travelled Europe, and he became a full academician and made a fortune from his art. In fact, he left some, believe it or not, £200,000 in his will. He was described by one of his biographers as a grotesque miser. Now, there's another aspect that I'd like to bring in. There's all these angles and facets that I'm building up in order to position Mary Moser and her flower painting in the right perspective for the late 18th century. Now, it's always assumed that in the 18th century, women didn't engage in art unless their father was an artist and they were particularly accomplished. But that's not true at all, because it ignores private art, which was very important, and wealthy women were taught by men to draw and paint. For example, George Stubbs, who painted the Wedgwood family, taught their 7 children, including their 4 daughters. Paul Sandby, who painted this, or drew this watercolor, was a popular drawing master. He probably tutored Lady Frances Scott, shown here. He's showing her here, incidentally, in her riding costume, sketching a scene outdoors with the help that this thing here is a camera obscura. And if a woman did acquire artistic skills good enough to enable her to sell her work, she was either too wealthy to need to sell her work, or once she married, she would have to stop selling her work, as it would be regarded as an insult to her husband if she earned money from her activity. That there are exceptions. Mary Beale, you might have heard of, was an 18th century artist whose husband acted as her assistant, but she was accepted by society as a freak occurrence, an exception. Now, we know from diaries that from the Restoration to the 1820s, elite women and even some middling sort women were expected to sketch and draw and paint, to the extent that it's clear from their diaries that if they weren't allowed to, they would feel deprived. I'm not saying that they sold their works. I'm saying that it was an activity that they engaged in on a regular basis and were known for excelling in. They felt pride in being able to do it. Some of them were particularly skillful. They could produce accurate portraits, and don't think of this amateur art as a lesser form of art. Think of it as an important form of art carried out by women artists, which has up to now been largely ignored or lost. Mary Moser, I said that she won a prize for her painting when she was 14. It's this painting here, or it's a flower study. But before talking more about her flower painting, I wanted to put flower painting itself in context so you could understand how it was perceived in 18th century England. It was originated as a branch of still life in the Netherlands 100 odd years before the 17th century. It was appropriate, or the advantage for women artists is that you needed no knowledge of anatomy. Paintings are relatively small size, could be painted indoors, and there were nevertheless elements of the painting, like the symbolism of the flowers, like a lily representing the Virgin Mary, or painting a memento mori or vanitas painting to refer to the brevity of life, which makes a flower painting much more than simply a copy of a vase of flowers. And I'll talk more about that. I'll come back, I think, to the Dutch flower painting and its inspiration. But before I do, I'll just put the history of flower painting prior to the Dutch painting of flowers. 3,500 years ago, the ancient Egyptians were painting flowers, and the earliest painting we have of flowers is of the lotus. Now, the reason is symbolism. The lotus was an important flower to the Egyptians because one of their founding or myths of the way the world was created was that the world was covered in water, and from the water a single lotus flower rose up and opened to reveal the sun god Atum. So it was associated with creation and healing and also spiritual rebirth, that it was also associated with the Nile because it rises up to the top of the water and then closes down every evening, so that regular rhythm is like the annual rhythm of the Nile with its annual flooding. And it was also linked to the goddess, I should say, Isis. Now, the woman here is holding the lotus flower and is actually smelling it, because it was thought in ancient Egypt that the strong scent of the lotus would restore the senses of the deceased once they'd reached the afterlife. And in front of her, there is a table containing wine and food to sustain her in the afterlife, and or to be used as offerings to any gods that she encountered on the way. So there's a lot of symbolism attached to this, and meaning once you know some of the aspects of Egyptian painting. Jumping on to ancient Rome, flower or vegetation and flower painting, decorating the walls as if it was the outside world, became very fashionable from about 50 BC to 50 AD. And this is It's actually now in the National Museum in Rome, but it's from the House of Livia, which is north of Rome, in remarkably good condition. It's a number of species of plants and birds and so on can be identified. It's quite an accurate painting. And this was a dining room, and it was fashionable to decorate your dining room as if you were sitting outside in the natural world. Moving forward, during the Middle Ages, there was a type of illuminated manuscript and also tapestries such as this one that were covered in mille fleurs, 1,000 flower tapestries, referring to these tiny little flowers regularly arranged on the green background as if growing on grass. And they were popular in the early Renaissance and late Middle Ages, and you might sort of recognize some of the aspects of it because it was revived by William Morris in the 19th century. And so that takes us up to this painting that includes a lot of flowers. In fact, there's 500 plant species depicted here, including 190 different flowers, of which a large number can be specifically identified. And I think it leads on, it was probably inspired by the 1,000 flower paintings of the tapestries. Just to explain what's going on here, because there's a floral element to La Primavera, the spring, as it's called. One of the most famous, most controversial paintings in the world, because controversial partly because we don't know what's going on, but I can explain some of the elements of the painting, and so you can start to put together possible stories. Over on the right, what you see here is March, the biting winds of March. That's the personification of Zephyr, the biting winds of March, who is transforming this nymph here, Chloris. She is transforming into this the goddess of spring, covered in flowers. It's Flora. So she is becoming Flora. Then in the middle, we have Venus, unusually clothed, with Cupid above her. And Cupid is firing the arrow straight towards the central one of the three graces, and the central grace is chastity. So I think the implication is that Cupid, blindfolded Cupid, is trying to subvert chastity into love. And then on the left is the personification of pleasure, and on the right, beauty. Again, unusually clothed. One of the reasons they might be clothed is that it might be a representation through Neoplatonic philosophy of that they associated the Greek gods and goddesses with figures in the Bible. And so the figure of Venus was often associated with the Virgin Mary. So it could be that the reason she's dressed is it's a sort of an association, a loose association between the two. And then finally, over on the left is Mercury raising his caudicus, his messenger's staff, towards some misty clouds. There's various interpretations of this. His staff is associated with magic and alchemy, and it's assumed he is keeping bad weather away. See, well, it's a bit not very clear, but up here, these are clouds, and this is his staff here, keeping the clouds away. And by extension, he's keeping bad things away from this happy group here. But there's been many levels of interpretation of this painting, but I don't want to get too sidetracked. So let's go back to the Netherlands, Dutch flower painting, which I'll come on to. This is Mary Moser first. These are two botanical studies, and I wanted to feed in here that when we say flower painting, there's another type of flower painting, which is botanical illustrations, which were very important in the Age of Enlightenment. And these are two botanical studies by Mary Moser. She was very skilled and in fact became recognized as a botanist and illustrator of botanical specimens. And of course, in the 19th century, there was the language of flowers, so-called. There was number of books. This is one called The Language of Flowers. In fact, this is a postcard I'm showing here, showing 18 different flowers and their symbolic meaning, but there were complete books written, and in fact, some of them are available on the internet, which shows the meaning of flowers, which was used if you wanted to send a bunch of flowers to your love. You could code up some quite complicated messages. The only problem is that if you look at these Victorian books and look at a number of them, you find that the same flower has multiple meanings. And so that if you weren't careful, you could send completely the wrong message. I assume that you made sure that the person receiving the flowers was using the same book as you. So that was the other aspect of flowers in the 19th century, but also in the 19th century, perhaps the most famous flower painting towards the end of the 19th century is Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers. And of course, we think of flowers, we think of the Impressionists like Claude Monet in his flower gardens at Giverny. And this is the artist's garden at Giverny. And in even flower paintings well into the 20th century, artists like Georgia O'Keeffe here, Oriental Poppies. But the flower paintings of Mary Moser followed on from the Dutch tradition. So, as I said, we'll go back to the beginnings of that. And tulip bulbs began to be imported. I think it was about the 1580s into Holland, but by the bit before mid 1600s, there was what was called tulip mania, when a single bulb like this one, this tulip here, the Viceroy tulip, could be 5 times the cost of an average house. And you can see that from this bulb catalogue. The price, the Verkocht here down here, is 3,000 to 4,200 guilders, depending the variation, depending on the weight, which is stated over here between 410 and 658. And just to put that in perspective, a craftsman, a skilled craftsman at the time, would earn 300 guilders a year. So this bulb is at least 10 times the annual earnings of a skilled craftsman. Of course, this bubble in prices, which grew and grew and grew, crashed suddenly. And it's often, we all often talk about the tulip mania and the way that as an exemplar of lots of markets that suddenly grow in, something grows in value and then suddenly crashes. And you might think, well, let me make clear, people at the time didn't think tulip bulbs were worth that much. They weren't stupid, but they saw people making a fortune buying and then selling the bulbs a week later, because prices were shooting up week on week. And you didn't even have to have the cash. You could buy futures. So this here, which, as I said, would cost more than the average house, you could buy a future so that in, say, a week's time, it was a promise that you would buy at an agreed price because you believed that in a week's time you could sell it for much more. So you would buy the bulb and sell the bulb simultaneously and make the difference. So people were making a fortune and could afford to buy these bulbs using this technique of buying futures, until one day, of course, suddenly the bottom fell out of the market and all those who'd bought futures went bankrupt. Incidentally, recent scholarship, there's a couple of papers I reference, suggest that it may have been exaggerated. I mean, not in terms of the prices that were paid, but in terms of the number of people involved and the number of people sucked into it. And the reason is because it's such a good parable for the excesses of greed and the way that people can be misled by Satan, if you like. And it was used as sort of a religious sermon to show the way people could be misled. Now, Dutch flower painting, which was more than 100 years before Mary Moser, but was an influence on English flower painting at Mary Moser's time. First of all, it was bought as an enduring substitute for the real thing, obviously, an obvious reason for flower painting. But there were many others. Let me go through them. I've identified there's sort of 7 aspects to it. A record of a luxury object and a substitute for the real thing. But in Dutch flower painting, they would often show flowers that were out of season or were not readily available or easy to grow in Holland, but were available around the Dutch Empire. And so it was also a reminder through those flowers that were shown of the wealth and global reach of the Dutch Empire. So it made them proud. And it was a scientific wonder. One of the reasons they show these tiny insects like this fly here, which is just here, is because at the time, scientists like Antony van Leeuwenhoek were experimenting with lenses and microscopes and opening up a whole new world, seeing things, God's creations, that hadn't been seen previously with the naked eye. And so it was the wonder of the microscopic world, a scientific wonder, which in turn would have been seen at the time as an expression of God's creation. Then, of course, it's a masterpiece of illusion, and the Dutch artist would go to enormous trouble to avoid the paint, the brushstrokes being seen. So it was almost, it was intended to be almost a photographic representation because of the love or an appreciation of the skill of the artist, which I think a lot of people today still appreciate that sort of skill. It was a demonstration of the taste and wealth of the owner, a glorification of God's natural world, which I've sort of spoken about before. A moral signpost from God was one of the expressions used. And finally, as I've also mentioned, memento mori, a vanitas painting, a reminder that we will all die because of the short life of cut flowers. And sometimes they even included fading flowers in their in the bouquet as a reminder. This is Mary Moser, Bars of Flowers, and her flower paintings are accurate. And as I said, she was recognized as a skilled botanist, but unlike the Dutch, she uses a much looser brushstroke. But these flower paintings were not just sold as a single painting, but were turned into engravings, which the print sellers could sell as decorative flower prints to hang on the wall for those that couldn't afford the paintings. but they're also used in pattern books, and they were templates for women to copy for embroidery or glass painting, which was very popular, and Japan work, copying onto undecorated white china. There was a sort of 101 uses for these prints derived from these paintings of flowers, through which the artist could make more money through selling rights. And also drawing masters specialized in teaching this sort of art were much in demand, because one of the types of painting that was most often taught to women was flower painting. And we can see in this painting, you've probably already noticed the large bird there. So she also included some rotting, some insects, some, should we call it humorous element? Is the bird just about to eat the butterfly? So there's sort of some recognition of the memento mori aspects in her paintings. This is summer, and unlike the Dutch, she always tended to paint in season. So the summer painting is only summer flowers, roses at the heart, poppy slightly to the right of the center, carnation at the top right. And she, as I said, included or painted them in a more what we call painterly way, more visible brushstrokes, rather than this illusionistic method the Dutch used. And you can see that in the next painting, just showing a close-up, so you can see the brushstrokes remain visible. And she developed a technique for creating the illusion of petals with just a single or a few brushstrokes over a base or ground color. And then on the next painting, you can see down here, you wouldn't normally notice it, but I'm drawing your attention to the highlights on the vase. It's just a few lines of light color and no attempt to blend them together. It would have been painted meticulously by 100 years before by the Dutch to represent the highlight on the vase, but we don't really notice it in the painting. And this is spring, and it shows various spring flowers. There's tulips, narcissi, auricula, and there's another element to this painting that was described as, and I'll read out the description, there is a melancholy to cut flowers. They bloom quickly and die continually, their exuberant illusion of life rudely dispelled over the course of a week. That moment of over-ripeness, the fulsome, florid, blousy display that comes just before the decay. Mary Moser certainly knew it. End of the quote. So you can see that that is an important element of how painting. So I said that they were flower paintings in the sense of decorating the walls, but they weren't just, there was more to them than that. They had these other elements that people would recognize. Frogmore House. And it was bought for Queen Charlotte by George III in 1792. It's in the grounds of Windsor Castle in Home Park, in its own grounds of 33 acres, and it was a favourite escape for Queen Victoria. And in fact, it was, you might remember, it was chosen by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle for their wedding reception. It was named Frogmore House because of the many frogs found in the marshy property. Now, the connection to Mary Moser is that she had already received several commissions from the king, and she knew Queen Charlotte and Princess Elizabeth, who visited her and were fond of Mary Moser. and she was commissioned to decorate an entire room at Frogmore House with flowers. It was afterwards called the Mary or the Miss Moser room. This is it. It was her most prestigious and most famous commission, and lucrative. She was paid the then considerable sum of £900, which made Mary Moser what was said at the time the envy of her male colleagues. It was also this assignment was one of her last professional works before she married in 1793, age 49. And the commission she was given was to create the illusion of an arbour open to the skies. The room survives today, but you can only visit the house in a group, and you can only go round in a guided tour. It was closed in the lockdown, but I think it's open again, but only for groups. This is Mary Moser, and it's called A Bunch of Flowers, and it's one of the canvases that are in the room. So, and it's one of the, if you visit, it's one of the paintings you'll see hanging in the room. She also taught the daughters of George III and, we believe, Queen Charlotte to draw, and probably at Frogmore House. Now, after the Frogmore House commission was completed, when she was 49, she married. After she married, she carried on painting, but she ceased to work professionally. She didn't sell any more work. She did it as a hobby. She did continue to exhibit as an honorary painter. Remember, she was an academician under her married name. So from that point onwards, she exhibited as Mary Lloyd. But the year of her marriage, there was a surprising and some might say shocking personal episode that I referenced right at the beginning. Let me backtrack a little bit. Early on, Mary Moser had set her cap at the artist Henry Fuseli, who painted this, The Nightmare. She convinced herself the feelings were mutual, but they weren't, because it's recorded that Henry Fuseli had set his heart, or his heart, unfortunately, had already been deeply pierced by Angelica Kauffmann. He was Swiss, he visited England, and on the advice of Joshua Reynolds, who he showed a few sketches, he decided to become an artist. Then he went, a few years later, he went to Italy, came back to England 8 years later. On the way back, he stopped in Switzerland. He was Swiss, as I said, fell madly in love with a young lady who many believe is the lady shown in this painting, but she was already engaged to a gentleman with better prospects than Fuseli, and so she rejected him. Now, when he returned, Moser still hadn't married, and it was said at the time, this is a quote, that she didn't compare with the dreamy, half angelic, adored Kauffmann. But she was jolly and agreeable, although it's also said that Mary Moser, had very strong opinions, and she had no objection to arguing with anyone if she didn't agree with them. So when Fuseli returned to England, he rejected Mary Moser, and Angelica Kauffmann still rejected him, and he married Sophia Rawlins, his ex-model, and soon after became an associate of the Royal Academy and then a full academician. But at that stage, he was pursued by the early feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who invited him to Paris, but Sophia Rawlins, I wasn't quite sure whether she had married him by that stage, but she put a stop to that. And he went on, he became a very successful and admired artist. And his pupils included John Constable, Benjamin Haydon, William Etty, Edwin Landseer. And he died when he was 84 after a life of uninterrupted good health. He was never ill. Now, just to remind you, of the person I showed you, Richard Cosway, on the bottom right. As I said, a more famous artist than Gainsborough at the time, portraits all the rage. And he was married to Maria Cosway, also a gifted and successful artist. Now, Maria Cosway gave up her career on the command of her husband, and he possibly did this to protect her reputation. But she couldn't stop painting, so she started painting again. She had a sort of nervous breakdown, and he allowed her to paint again. She was Italian-English artist who famously, I think she's best known, Maria Cosway, for the affair she had with Thomas Jefferson, the American founding father, who part author of the Declaration of Independence and third president. And despite, in fact, that Maria Cosway was a devout Catholic all her life. And she was also not just an artist, she was a composer, musician, and an authority in female education. And it's believed she married him. It was a marriage of convenience, as she was 20 years younger, and it was eventually annulled. So Richard Cosway, who was famous, he painted a lot of miniatures, which maybe is why he's not so well known today. He was born in Devon, travelled to London when he was 12 and won a prize at the Society of Artists. And he exhibited this work when he was 20, and he soon, because of that, he was soon in demand. He painted the future King George IV. He was appointed painter to the Prince of Wales. And he was described at the time, and this is a quote, as a libertine and commonly described as resembling a monkey. Well, I don't know about that, but that's the way he was described at the time. Later in life, he suffered mental disorders and had to be institutionalized. I can now, having explained these complex personal relationships, I can now return to Mary Moser. She just married, 1793, Captain Hugh Lloyd, a widower. And as I said, she retired from painting, but continued to exhibit as Mary Lloyd. And that same year, she had an open affair with Richard Cosway, who by then had separated from Maria Cosway. And the two of them took a 6-month sketching tour across Europe. In his notebooks, Cosway makes what are described as lascivious statements about his sexual activities, which he describes with Mary Moser, compares her skills in bed to those of his wife. Apparently, it seems Moser was more sexually responsive than his wife, even though she was 50 and Maria was only 33. But I can't explain why, but this scandal doesn't seem to have affected her status in society. And as far as I can tell, she remained friends with Queen Charlotte and Princess Elizabeth. I don't know why. Maybe it wasn't common knowledge and it only came out later after she died. I don't know. Now, her father had died already, 1783, aged 78, and he was deeply mourned because I didn't go into a lot of detail about his life, but he was much loved, and he was described by Joshua Reynolds as the father of the present race of artists. He was amiable, industrious, and diligent. He was great attention to detail in everything he did in terms of his art and organization. A perfect sort of keeper of the Royal Academy. And she, as I said, continued to exhibit, and what I'm showing you here is some of the paintings that she exhibited at the Royal Academy after she'd married, but she was no longer selling her paintings. And despite the affair, she remained happily married, by the way. Her husband obviously knew about it, but accepted it. And again, surprisingly, she remained good friends with Richard Cosway for the rest of their lives and his ex-wife, Maria. And in fact, Mary Moser left Maria 20 guineas in her will. She died first. She died aged 75 on May the 2nd, 1819 in Tottenham Court Road. And after her death, no more women were elected to the Academy until Laura Knight in 1936. And she is now more famous than her father, although, as I said, nowadays not very well known. Flower painting, as I've already described, continued in England in the 19th century. It was very popular, although other forms of still life became more popular, such as the detailed rendition of birds' nests became very popular. So, as I've made clear, Mary Moser was a leading artist at the time, the youngest founding member of the Royal Academy. She was even proposed as candidate for the presidency, as I said at the beginning. How many people had heard of Mary Moser at the beginning of this talk? Probably not many, but I hope I have corrected that. Thank you for your time and attention.